So Toney is the head of the science division here in Greenbank, and he will be talking today about the GBT's dynamic scheduling system. Toney is also in charge of the GBT schedule. So take it away, Toney.
All right, hopefully everyone can see my screen. Is that the case?
Yes,
All right.
it's full screen-ish.
And did it advance? I've had problems with this before.
Yes, we're on your second slide.
Okay. So the GBT is scheduled, 24 to 48 hours in advance based on the weather. And this allows us to maximize the excellent high frequency weather we get when it does come through. The DSS is taking into account things like the water vapor in the atmosphere, the amount of aerosols, basically dust particles or other small chemicals like ozone and other chemicals which affect how well radio waves at high frequencies can go through the atmosphere. Also, whether it's clear or cloudy will impact continuum observations, so that needs to be taken into account. Whether the moisture in the atmosphere is water or ice can make a big difference. I've actually been seen cases where we couldn't see through the atmosphere, and then all of a sudden the rain changed to snow, and it was one of the best weather conditions we had for an observation. And also the winds can move the telescope around, and we have to take those into account. So we have weather forecasts that are good for about 3.5 days out, and really believable for about 2 days out that we use for determining what observations can and can't happen. In the scheduling system, we do have what's called the pizza plot, which tells us overall what frequencies are good and when they're good to observe. You can find these out in the system. Basically, red is bad, and green is okay, and blue is between red and green. So to get into the DSS, you just log into this address here. But to get into the DSS, you do have to have an account in the my.nreo.edu system. So this is basically if you've submitted a proposal, you do have a PST account, and the DSS uses the exact same username and password as the PST, but this is not your computing account. So don't confuse it with what you use to log into a Windows or Linux machine. This is a different account completely. So once you get into the DSS, you'll see a page that looks a lot like this. Up at the top, you have a bunch of useful links up there. You can go and see what the current GBT observing schedule is. You can also look at those weather forecasts. You can pull up those pizza plots. You can lots of other information. There's plots of opacity versus frequency versus time. They're available in water vapor versus time. Many things there. If you want to submit an observer comment, you can do that either during your while you're observing, or after your project's complete. You can go there and submit those. Please use the help desk if you run into any issues. We can then try to find solutions for you. And also, don't forget about the documentation there. I mean, who reads the documentation? It's only important and tells you what to do and how to do it. And then if you are on any of the other pages in the DSS, you can click on the home and come back to your profile page. And then of course there's a log out area. You can change your preferences by clicking that little preferences bar. This has things such as what your default email would be to notify you for observations, contact information that the operators may use to get hold of you during an observation and various things. You'll also see an area that lists all your active projects and provides links to the project pages within the DSS. And then any upcoming observations that you do have will be listed over here in the upcoming observations area on the right. You should note that sometimes this area shows up at the bottom of the DSS page, and that's simply because of a font size and the way the page gets laid out. So you might have to change the font size to get that to show up on the right side. You also can create an iCal link to add anytime that you're scheduled into whatever your favorite calendar is, you know, such as Google Calendars or other things. That can be helpful. So if we move on down the page, we'll see other information like this. You'll have upcoming reservations. So this is a list of dates when you're visiting Green Bank. Hopefully you'll be able to visit sometime in the near future. When you do, please make sure that your reservations do show up in this area on your page, because if they don't, then you're not getting the boost in the DSS that visiting observers get. You actually get a slight increase in score when you're on site, and it's important to make sure that your reservation does show up so you do get that boost. And it improves your chances of your project being scheduled. Also down below is the dynamic contact information that does provide the emails and phone numbers of how to contact you. This information is not public for anyone to see, but it is there so operators or other Green Bank staff do know how to get in contact with you regarding your observations. So there is a link there, my.nreo.edu, that is used to update this information. It's the same information in the proposal submission tool, so it's you need to keep this up to date so we know how to contact you either regarding proposals and their dispositions and observing. You can put in more dynamic contact information. Say you're going to be on vacation, you know, a different address or phone number where you can be contacted during that time, and you can put that in with the that section. And please make sure you keep these up to date so we know how to contact you. And we cannot track the 5,000 or so people that are in the system all, so it is really up to you to keep that information up to date. Any projects that you've completed in the past will show up in the completed projects section. And you also can enter blackout dates, times when you're not available to observe, in the blackout dates section. So you just click the edit link to add those in. So we'll go through what that page looks like now. This probably will be updated sometime in the near future. So by the time you observe, it might look different, but there's no guarantee on when exactly that will be released. I know they're thinking about working on that now to make it more usable. One thing to warn you about, blackouts can be repeated, but only on weekly or monthly timescales. You can't repeat one on a daily timescale. So if you need a blackout from noon to 1 every day of the week, you'll have to enter 7 different blackouts to cover that. And then, so another warning, if you do have many repeating short blackouts, it can keep your project from being scheduled for significant periods of time. We actually encountered one incident, a person who had a blackout from 3 to 5 every weekday, and it essentially kept their project from being scheduled for 6 months of the year. anytime that your blackout goes through the LST range of when your project can be scheduled, and it cuts down the amount of time that your project needs, then the blackout wins and you will not be scheduled. So really be careful about how you use the repeating blackouts and how it can affect your chances of being scheduled. So at this point, we'll go ahead and look at what one of the project pages looks like. So here's a screenshot of that. So every project has a friend because everybody needs a friend. This is a local GBT staff person who is an expert that can help you out with many aspects of your observation, including developing scripts, helping to arrange things for a visit to the telescope, answering questions about the system, and just including data reduction and all aspects of things from the time your proposal is accepted through the time of publication. A friend can help you. There's also a section which indicates whether the proposal is part of a student's thesis. That's for our information, so we know, have some clues to how much support and effort we should be putting into projects. You also have how much time is allocated to the project, and also an indication of how much time has already been completed or whether the project's already completed and been closed off, whether the semester ended or you completed all your observing time. And then sometimes there are periods when your receiver is not available to be used. That will show up in the receiver's unavailable area. Now, you have to be careful about this because it uses OR logic. So if your project has L or S band and only S band's down, then it'll see the L band's there and will not list that S band's unavailable. So it's only if all the receivers that you need are unavailable will they show up in that section. And then if you do have any of the project team members showing up on site, their reservations should show up in the upcoming reservations section, no matter which person on the project team will be visiting. Your project sessions are what's actually going to be scheduled on the telescope. And so it's very important to make sure the information there is as correct as can be. So first you have a name of the session, and that's what will appear in the emails that the DSS sends out for the schedule. Next, you have the right ascension and declination that are being used to schedule the session. So there's essentially only one right ascension and declination used in the scheduling. And you might have sources spread out all over the sky or fairly tightly grouped. Typically the average of those RA and DECs are used of all your sources, and then that's used for scheduling. So if this is RA and DEC is not above the horizon, the GBT has a 5-degree horizon limit, then you're not going to be scheduled. So it's very important to make sure that the correct right ascension and declination is in there. There are LST limits that can also be applied. We'll get to that in a little bit. But it's really important to make sure that that value is set up correctly. Also, what frequency is going to be used will determine how the DSS looks at the weather and whether you can be scheduled. So you might have several bands across there, say maybe an observation L band and Argus in the same session. That frequency is set up at 90 gigahertz. You're only going to observe in the best weather. If it's set at 1.5 gigahertz, then you can wind up observing the rain, which isn't too good for Argus. So you want to really make sure that those are set appropriately for your observations. And especially for observations using the KFPA receiver, it's really important to make sure you set those appropriately for the lines that you're after. because many times the weather's not good enough to observe the water line. There's just too much water vapor back there. But it can be perfectly okay to get observations of the ammonia lines, which are off the water line by a few gigahertz. And so the default is somewhere near the water line for the KFPA. So you might miss observing chances if you don't make sure that that value has been set correctly. Next, you'll see the receivers that are going to be used for each session. Just note that it uses and or logic for these. So if it's the and logic, then all the receivers listed have to be available before it'll be considered for scheduling. So if you have L and S is not available, then your session can't be scheduled. But if it has or logic, say L or S band, then only one of those has to be available and the session can be scheduled. Then we have the time allocated and as the first number, and then the amount of time that's been billed or observed will show up as the second number. Please note that as soon as you go on the schedule, the time shows up as billed, and only afterwards when we review the operator's logs and make corrections for any lost time will the time billed be come back down. So you have to give us a day or so typically, or if things are really hectic during certain periods of time, it might take many days to get that fixed, but we do try to keep on top of that. Then you have the minimum and maximum time that your session will be considered to be scheduled. So it's important to set those numbers correctly. Typically, the default is a minimum time of 3 hours or the amount of time allocated to the session if it's less. And maximum duration can be 3 hours to the maximum amount of time allocated to the session. So you just want to make sure that these parameters are set up correctly. Then the next line there is the type, or next column I should say. These can be spectral line, continuum, pulsar, VLBI, radar, and so on. The big thing is to make sure that if you do need continuum observations, that it does say continuum there. That means that it will the DSS will then check whether it's cloudy or clear. If it's spectral line, it doesn't really do a check of whether it's clear weather or cloudy weather. And one thing I should note is that if you are visiting Green Bank and you do look up and see that it's cloudy and you say, hey, why are my August observations scheduled? Just remember those clouds could be high enough and made completely of ice, or they could be very low level clouds trapped in an inversion layer between the mountains, which are on either side of the GBT. And if they're ice, then you could really don't have any impact on the opacity. You can still observe. We also have priorities assigned to every proposal by the TAC. They'll be either A, B, or C, with C being filler time. The rank does go into the final score the DSS uses to schedule a project. So A rank gets a higher score than a B or C, and B is higher than C. You can control what sessions you want to have scheduled by enabling or disabling. So you have to have a session checked for it to be considered to be scheduled. So if nothing's checked, then your project will not be scheduled. And there are other parameters which are used to control the scheduling of your project. And it's important for you to know about these. And a lot of times they can be very useful to projects. So if you're not granted actual monitoring periods, but you have to do pseudo monitoring, or you have other reasons to say, I need 2 weeks between my observations, there is a minimum wait time that we can set. And so after the first observation is scheduled, the DSS will not consider scheduling that session again until after this minimum wait time has occurred. And for all projects, that default is 0. There's the chi factor, which allows for projects to observe under slightly worse weather conditions. If you're observing, say, a maser line, which is really bright, then you can do that under not the optimal weather conditions, but slightly worse conditions. So we can change this parameter, and it just improves your chances of being scheduled. So it really depends on the science that you're trying to do. The default value is 1. Commonly used, if you can go to slightly worse weather, is 1.2. Or if you really don't care too much about the weather, you just have to be able to see somewhat out of the atmosphere, a value of 1.2 can work, but that's only used rarely at 1.2. We do have LST exclusion and inclusions. The reason we use both is that way we don't have to have logic to go across the 0-24-hour boundary in LSTs. So if you can always include or exclude time periods by using one of those two options. And the default is that your observations are not restricted. Your source just has to be above the horizon. So there is a parameter that allows us to set a source size. The default's essentially 0. So it's assuming that it's trying to schedule for a point source. But if you do have an extended source, we can put that information in. And basically what this allows us to do is observe at higher winds, because the telescope beam will be bouncing around more, but it still remains on source. And so if you're trying to do a detection experiment of a very extended source, then the wind you can possibly observe in higher winds and deal with things. Then we have a parameter that's tracking error threshold. So if you can tolerate the beam bouncing around a lot more, you don't need as tight a calibration because of that, you can observe at higher winds also. So what we typically have assumed is that you want all your calibration to be good to within at least 10%. So we try to keep the errors from the wind blowing the telescope around to be below 10%. But if you're just after a detection experiment, you just want to say, you know, the source is there or that line is there, and you might say, I can deal with the 50% calibration error, then you can observe in higher winds by setting this parameter. Now, of course, you know, say a pulsar observation can go down to the 5-degree elevation limit, whereas an Argus observation in the atmosphere becomes too opaque, you know, once you get down to that low in elevation. So it might need to observe at an elevation, say above 30 degrees. And so we can set what those elevation limits are for scheduling your project. Each receiver has its own default that's put in the system. So if you need something that's different or specific, then we can set this elevation limit. So there is a radiance parameter, which is used for continuum observations. And this is basically taking the infrared flux and measured from one per geometer looking upwards and one looking downwards. That difference is used to try to guess how much cloud cover there is. It's mostly dominated by the temperature of the atmosphere, but it does have some indication of the cloud cover in there. And so we can set that for continuum observations to try to get clear weather. And then there is a parameter to avoid being near the sun. You know, typically, as long as you're about 10 beam widths away from the sun, that shouldn't have significant side lobes coming into the system. But if you want to, for whatever reason, avoid the sun for a bigger angle than that, then we do have a parameter that we can set. There are different times of day when observations can be limited to. The default is it can be scheduled any time of day. There is a parameter for optical nighttime, which is sunset to sunrise. There are cases where it's preferred to have the observation happen when the sun's below the horizon. There's also an RFI night. This is time periods when we expect the RFI to be less. It doesn't necessarily all go away, but it can be significantly reduced. This is typically 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. local time. And then we have the thermal nighttime, which is used to schedule observations, say with Mustang or August. And this is when the telescope is thermally stable. It's only changing temperature slowly, and so the surface tends to behave a lot better, not needing auto-OOF corrections as often. And when you get the best high frequency observing time. And this is 3 hours after sunset to about sunrise, depending on where your source is located and the actual weather conditions. This can be extended to about 2 hours after sunrise. Especially if your source is to the east, the dead surface itself will actually block the sunlight, which keeps the backup structure roughly the same temperature, and you can actually observe longer looking nearer the sun right after sunrise. Then if you have to observe your source when it transits, say for polarization calibration observations, there is a transit flag. There's also a flag for the keyhole. This is when a source gets it too high an elevation that the azimuth motion is too quick for the telescope to keep up. And so there's about, depending on the time of year, a 5 to 10 degree region near the zenith where the telescope can't track a source. And if you're going to go through that, you can set the keyhole parameter, and that just keeps the DSS from scheduling you when your source is up near that region of the sky. So we'll go back to the DSS project page now and go on down the page. Of course, there's upcoming scheduled periods are shown there. You do have a calendar which provides a quick look information of things like when you have blackouts for various observers, when you are scheduled, periods when the project can't be scheduled, say it's a maintenance day and your source is only visible during the time that maintenance would be happening, that might show up as a grayed out area. And then going on further down, there's a list of the project team members. This is initially set by who's on the proposal, but you can request team members to be added on later on as long as they have a PST account and have logged into the DSS. We can add them to any projects. We do have emails for each team member, which ones the PI is indicated, so they're the first one contacted if there's by the operators if there's a problem, unless someone else observing. Contact is, you will always get emails from the DSS concerning your project whenever there's an email about the project. By default, the PI should always get it because they're the one responsible for all aspects of the project. Once you're approved for remote observing, that should show up yes, it'll be blank otherwise. And then another important part is that all observers should be checked, whether who can actually perform observations on the telescope. And if you have no observers checked, then you will not get scheduled. So you need to have at least one observer checked to be considered for scheduling. And if you're not on site, then that person has to be remote for you to be considered. Again, information on your project friend will be shown along with their email. In a few rare cases, we require the friend to be present for an observation. This is typically for something that's really advanced or really pushing the system in ways we didn't expect. And you'll see a checkbox show up there if we are requiring the friend to be present for the observation. That just invokes the friend's blackout dates when considering scheduling the project. A list of all the observer blackouts for all the project team members will be shown in this section. in the DSS. There's another feature in the DSS which we can turn on, which is blackouts for the entire project team. It's called Project Blackouts. So rather than have each member enter a blackout, say from 8 to noon for Tuesday because everyone's off at some project meeting, we can set these. You can request to have the project blackouts turned on, and you only have to enter one project blackout instead of, say, a blackout for all 20 team members. So it can make life easier. Then down below is some time accounting areas where you list of all observing periods that have been completed on the telescope. And it'll show you the scheduled time that was put on the schedule and the amount of time that was actually charged for each observation. So it allows you to follow the bookkeeping for the project. If you are doing a monitoring observation, then you'll be scheduled in windows. This is periods of time when your project can be scheduled. And it'll list the upcoming windows, so the start and end date for those windows, how much observing time that you'll have, which session is coming up, you know, the start and the end date, how much time it has, and how much time's been billed, and whether the observations have been completed. The rare occasions we might add project notes or scheduling notes. These are rarely used, but important when we need to add them. The abstract from your proposal is listed on the project page, along with the disposition letter. And this is mainly for the, so that everyone has the same reference to understand that, especially the friend or telescope operator. So if there are any special restrictions or anything, that information is accessible. And just finally, I'd like to note that if you need to make any changes to any of these DSS parameters, other than say the checking, enabling sessions and checking observers or entering blackout dates, you have to request that these changes be made. We're happy to do these for you or to give you guidance on what the appropriate values might need to be. So just email us that information, and we're happy to adjust things. And any email should go to myself and the project friend. And basically, that's just a quick run through of the DSS. So if anyone has questions, be happy to answer them now.
Thank you very much, Tony. One came in asking if you had to have a project proposal in the system to create an account.
No, anybody can create an account at my.nrio.edu. You don't have to ever submit a proposal. So say adding a new student in, they would just create the my.nrio.edu account, then use that same username and password to log into the DSS. And at that point, we could add them onto your proposal team without them ever having to have submitted a proposal.
There are no other questions in the chat right now, but I have another one. In order for everyone to be marked as a trained observer, should they all create an account if they do not have one already in the next few days?
Yes, they should do that very soon. So after the meeting, essentially who organized it will send me a list of the people that participated. I will then go through and check people off as remote observers who are already in the DSS. If by whatever reason you're not able to have an account by the time I do that, then sometime in the future, just send me an email once you do have an account, and then we can set you up as remote at that point in time. We just go back and check the list of people that attended the school and make sure that that's happened. And yeah, people can enable sessions whenever they're ready. Just know that once the session's enabled, it can be scheduled. So you really want to make sure you have your scripts and everything ready so you can be prepared to observe, because you might enable it and then get scheduled within 48 hours of the time that you enable it. So you just want to make sure that you're prepared for observing when you enable your sessions.
That is only if someone on the proposal is remote trained, correct?
Right.
So you can enable
Or
it
if
now, but it
someone's
won't
on
be.
site visiting.
Yep. All right, any other questions for Toney?
And always feel free to contact me or your friends if you have any questions or concerns about how you're being scheduled, or whether you need to change any parameters or anything within the DSS. We're happy to help you.
Pausing just for any final questions.
So I just want to make sure I understand this correctly. We need to register for an account so that we can then start planning observations or whatever it is that we need to do so we can set up for our time.
Yeah, if you're already on a proposal, you should already have an account that that automatically gets transferred into the DSS from the proposal submission tool. But if a person is being added to a project that hasn't been on a proposal, then they do need to set up a account in PST and then log into the DSS before we can add them to the proposal.
So Toney will go through in a few days, and everyone who is part of this training, he will go through the list of accounts in DSS and mark yes, remote trained, yes, remote trained. But if your name's not in that list of people who have DSS accounts, he can't mark you as trained.
Great, thank you.
Any last questions? All right, hearing none, thank you very much, Toney.
All right. Hope everyone has a good rest of your day.